You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
We're running on fumes today. That goes for the entire political class on early flights out of New Hampshire, some late flights out of Boston because they don't hang around after a contest like that, not for very long. Of course, the Nikki Haley campaign has big work to do. And while Donald Trump never stays overnight there to begin with. Still in Manchester, though, with the cleanup, is my partner in crime, Kailey Leinz. We had a late night with a very early call. Kailey, we've learned a lot more since then, though, about turnout, about margins, and big questions remaining about what the heck Nikki Haley does from here. How does it feel this morning in New Hampshire?
Well, tired, Joe. It feels like whatever energy was here, even though energy was probably less than New Hampshire primaries in the past, has been kind of zapped at this point because the feeling is that primary season may be over. We may now be just in the general election. Granted, that's not what Nikki Haley messaged last night. She intends to take this through to South Carolina. And looking at the margin, Joe, I'm not sure we have a firm answer of whether or not it indicates that she should or should not do that. Remember, when we all woke up yesterday morning here in New Hampshire, it was to news of the Suffolk University poll that said Trump was leading by 22 points at 60%. Ultimately, the margin we got was about half that, 11 points. Yes, that's still a pretty wide gulf between first and second place. Maybe not the strongest showing for Nikki Haley in second place, but I guess it could have been worse. It's just a question of what happens over the course of the next 4 weeks leading up to South Carolina, because right now Nikki Haley, as we well know, Joe, is polling significantly farther behind Trump in that state. She's down more than 30 points there. Is she going to want to be embarrassed like that in her home state where she served as governor?
Yeah, we're going to talk about all of this in a minute with David Paleologos because we haven't had a heck of a lot of research since that Emerson poll showed how far behind Nikki Haley actually was in her home state, Kailey. That was before we had several candidates drop out, though, and I wonder what that shakeout is going to look like in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, Joe, what we learned here in New Hampshire is perhaps the dropping out of Chris Christie from the race may have benefited Nikki Haley, but for Vivek Ramaswamy and Ron DeSantis, who dropped out between Iowa and New Hampshire, it seems like a lot of those votes did go to Trump, Republican votes, that is. Of course, a lot of the votes Nikki Haley got here in New Hampshire are independents, more moderate Republicans. South Carolina doesn't really reflect that demographic. As we know, Joe, it's a much more conservative state. Trump has a very strong base of support there. It's going to be really hard, but her campaign indicates maybe it's not just about South Carolina. When you look ahead to Super Tuesday, a week and a half or so later on March 5th, 11 of those 16 states have open or semi-open primaries. So maybe she could try to galvanize the support of independents, former Democrats, for example. There, the issue is she wasn't able to pull that off here in New Hampshire. So it remains a question this morning of whether she is actually able to pull that off in any other state.
Yep, you said it. Kailey, great to see you, and great job last night. We'll check back with you a little bit later before you are wheels up from Manchester, New Hampshire. Kailey Leinz reporting from Bloomberg at the scene of the crime. As we add the voice of David Paleologos, he ran that poll that Kailey mentioned, Suffolk University Political Research Center director. Easy for me to say, David, it's good to see you. When folks woke up to your poll that morning in New Hampshire and saw Donald Trump at 60%, we thought, all right, so much for the strong finish. Let me start broadly with you here. How do you feel about the spread and the chances that Nikki Haley has to gain momentum from New Hampshire?
So the spread was, as indicated, about half of what we showed. 22 versus 11. Both had Donald Trump winning comfortably. What we're looking at is the margin of error. And so I wasn't pleased that we're now teetering on not being in the margin of error. And what I mean by that is that our final track showed Trump at 59.6. And the actual, last time I checked, Trump votes were 54.4. So it's just outside that 4.4% margin of error. And same thing with Nikki Haley. Nikki Haley currently is in the low 40s. We had Nikki Haley at 38%, just outside the margin of error. They're still counting votes, but I believe it will still be outside the margin of error. I will say that of the last 5 polls that were taken, the Suffolk poll had Nikki Haley the highest, even though it was still low at 38%. So it wasn't our best New Hampshire poll, but I think that the trend line was pretty consistent. And if you look at the Real Clear Politics average, it was very close.
By the time you turn that into a daily a rolling poll, it was one of the most important indicators we have. And I realize, you're not adding that much of a sample on the daily, but you gave everybody, it seems, the right direction in where this was going. David, so I'll congratulate you on that. Donald Trump said last night after listening to Nikki Haley's speech, I will call it a concession speech, even though it didn't really sound like one. He called her delusional. Is he right?
No, I think she may be cagey. Staying in, really, nobody, myself, you, no one should really be commenting. I mean, it's a personal decision, but she stays in not to beat him with delegates. There were too many close primaries and winner take all. Trump's just going to amass a huge lead. Staying in means, could I be the last person standing if Trump were to be convicted? And knowing how independents will turn on Trump if he is convicted. So it's not that she thinks that there's a path delegate-wise. I mean, she's going to lose all the delegates in Nevada. She's not eligible. But, why not? If she's got the money, why not give it a shot in South Carolina? The problem with staying in South Carolina and losing badly, let's say she loses by another 12 points, 11, 10 points, what then? What then, and especially what then for 2028?
So it's looking like South Carolina, the last stand. If she stays in, there's some are of the mind that she might drop out before if it looks like a potential embarrassment, to your point, that might impact her reputation going forward. But the last I can see, by the way, at least in terms of major polls, was Emerson, January 5th, Trump 54, Haley 25 in South Carolina. That was before Ron DeSantis bailed, and I wonder if you've seen anything newer than that, if that's the baseline 4 weeks out.
Yeah, I haven't seen anything newer. I think the pre-polling is going to be the same. It's going to be, even if she jumps up 5-10 points, Trump will be ahead by maybe not 30 points, but maybe by 20 points. And then it'll be whether or not, she gets close and loses by 10 or 12. I think there are too many traditional voters, Republican voters in South Carolina, as there were in Iowa, for her to totally turn the tables. But it's definitely worth a shot. And I think for Super Tuesday, Joe, she came somewhat close. I mean, it wasn't really that close in New Hampshire. And the spread was 30% registered Republicans in New Hampshire and 40% independents. If she stayed through Super Tuesday, she could win Massachusetts. Massachusetts is only 10% registered Republicans and 60% independents. So, and I don't have polling to support that, but my guess is if the ratio was 30-40 and she was within 11, the ratio is 10 Republicans, 60 independent. She probably, but then what? Right? She wins. Right. She Massachusetts. That doesn't really get her anything further in terms of the total delegate count.
I think it says a lot about the Republican contest if it's coming down to battleground Massachusetts. David, this jumped off the page this morning. Wall Street Journal crunching numbers from AP Votecast last night. Warning signs for Trump. 19% of Republicans who cast ballots in New Hampshire said they would be so dissatisfied with Trump as the nominee they would not vote for him in November. We saw a similar number who participated in the Iowa caucuses say the very same thing. We know there was a lot of noise with independents in New Hampshire. How much of a concern is this for the Trump campaign, or is this just fringe conversation at this point?
No, but I think in that analysis, they should have included that they weren't automatically voting for Biden. They weren't comfortable voting for Trump, but they may vote third party. So it's not a +2 difference, -1 from Trump and +1 for Biden. It might have been -1 for Trump, but +1 for Kennedy. So I think and it's the same thing with black voters who are less enthusiastic about Trump. It doesn't mean that they're going to rotate to Trump, they may rotate to Cornel West or Jill Stein or a third-party candidate. And that's why I think this is setting up for a potential story for a strong independent candidate, whether it's no labels or right now it's RFK Jr. who's got the most for an independent. But with this kind of matchup, the Trump-Biden matchup, a third-party option is more viable to me.
Well, that's sure seeming like it. David, we've talked to folks at No Labels who've told us, and you've heard this before, if by Super Tuesday this does seem clear that it's Trump versus Biden, we're running a candidate. They're not on the ballot in every state, though, and that's partly why people say this is just a spoiler act, because they don't have a real chance of winning. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, Ross Perot was on every ballot. I mean, even the Libertarian, Joe Jorgensen, last time around was on every ballot. So ballot access is important, and every state has their own rules and regs. Look at Nevada. That's a mess for the primary. I mean, you've got a primary, but no delegates are allotted to the primary, and only the caucuses, and Nikki Haley's not eligible. And so every state has their own rules, and every party within every state, acts accordingly. But yeah, I mean, I think those are issues that we're going to continue to track going forward.
Big win last night for Joe Biden. I'm sorry. It's just to think of a president of the United States at this stage of the game in a write-in campaign, 55%. Dean Phillips, he said, look at me, I could get 20%, and he almost did, 19.5. Is the Dean Phillips act over? Did he prove a point? What do we get on the Dem side?
Well, I mean, you've got the same problem on the Dem side. I mean, why would a Democrat who's supporting Joe Biden go in and embarrass Joe Biden by going in and voting for Dean Phillips? So again, this is the reason why Democrats, Republicans, and mostly independents, they don't want this matchup. And it's from afar, it's very interesting to observe, because it's almost like the political parties set up their primaries and caucuses deliberately to benefit the people who are eventually going to win. And, I know that the people have spoken, but look, I mean, the public is going to be forced to pick a candidate, if they only pick one of two, a candidate that's the lesser of two evils, and that doesn't speak well for the system.
And so therefore, what we have in common now on both sides is this idea that you can have a campaign hang in there just barely enough to be available in case the front runner becomes incapacitated, whether it's Dean Phillips, or I guess that's not the most respectful way to describe Nikki Haley's campaign right now, but if she just decides to nibble along and get delegates to stay in the game in case somebody gets convicted of something, for instance, that really is the same campaign strategy that Dean Phillips is running.
Yeah, exactly. And it might be the wise strategy. She's going, in the states that allocate proportionally, she is going to pick off delegates. But if there's a kumbaya moment or not in Milwaukee at the Republican convention, for example, who are they going to pick? Nikki Haley? I mean, Nikki Haley, even in New Hampshire last night, and it was similar to the polling, she was losing by 50 points among registered Republicans in New Hampshire, 50. Yeah. And were it not for Governor Sununu's ground operation identifying Trump-hating independents and increasing that proportion. So how do you nominate Nikki Haley when she's not, she's not liked by such a wide margin? And so you may have someone drafted on the Democratic side, but also on the Republican side, if things don't work out legally for former President Trump.
And God knows we have this fantasy of a contested convention every 4 years, and it never happens. But boy, it seems like something could be real. David, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming along. David Paleologos, Suffolk University Political Research Center Director, with the latest numbers here on the trail. I'm Joe Mathieu in Washington. We're back in the Capitol. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
Another incredible experience here covering Iowa and New Hampshire back to back. By the way, the final in New Hampshire, Donald Trump 54, Nikki Haley 43. Remembering the poll that we walked into this from Suffolk University, it said 60% for Donald Trump. But of course, this had a lot more to do with the trajectory of these two candidates, not necessarily predicting the spread. And that's where we start our conversation with somebody who not only knows polls, but New Hampshire as well as anyone here. Andrew Smith, director of the University of New Hampshire Survey Center, is back with us. He's been a reliable voice, as always, through this process. And Andrew, it's great to see you this day after. I wonder your thoughts, because we were speculating, we were wondering what was going to happen 24 hours before the contest. You were with us here on Bloomberg. Did New Hampshire just pick the Republican nominee?
I think so, unless something dramatic happens between now and the convention, either legal or medical or who knows what else it would be. But it has to be incredibly dramatic for Trump not to get the nomination. I think that maybe the only outside chance that Haley has, and I think maybe this is why she's continuing to go, is if she's a viable candidate and can build up a certain number of delegates, she may be able to be in a position, should something happen, to be seen as the next most logical Republican to be the nominee for November. But it would really require on something outside of control of the campaign.
Isn't that something? So there's almost no point in advertising. Just wait around and see what happens, I guess. Some of the data that we pulled out of the voting last night, Andrew, among independent voters, I'd like to hear from you on this, because they, of course, characterize New Hampshire in a very special way. Among independent voters, 66% said they would not vote for Donald Trump in November if he was the nominee. What does that mean to you as you look forward to a general that could already be underway?
Well, I would say, first off, we have to discount there may be 10% or so of those independents who voted in the primary yesterday. They're really Democrats. They vote actively Democratic typically. They're not going to vote for Trump regardless. But what I've seen over the history here in New Hampshire, but also in the history of political science going back to research published in the 1960s, is that the partisanship is such a strong driver of what goes on. And my sense is that those Republicans who say they're never going to vote for Trump, they'll rationalize why Trump is better than Biden when it comes around to November. It's like, yeah, we know he's a skunk, but our skunk is better than your party's skunk. So you'll see a lot of that. We heard that in 2016. We heard that in 2020 as well from Republicans.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, there are a lot of questions about how Nikki Haley is going to spend the next 4 weeks. How can she learn from what happened in New Hampshire to potentially improve her chances here? Because the makeup in New Hampshire is like a different universe from what she's going into in South Carolina.
I don't know if there is that much to learn from New Hampshire, because frankly, I think she ran an excellent race here. She did about as good as you could expect anybody to do, where you've got Donald Trump getting a significant majority of those registered Republican voters. She played the only hand that she had, but the cards were relatively weak, and she did an excellent job with a weak hand. She's going into South Carolina where her cards are even weaker, not because she's not popular in the state and she's better known, but South Carolina's electorate, they elected Donald Trump significantly in 2016 and in 2020. And I don't think they'll see any reason why they should throw him overboard, even if it is for a governor that they know and like.
Your poll, Andrew Smith, of a little less than 2 weeks ago had them within single digits. That changed pretty quickly as candidates began dropping and as they moved through Iowa. When are we going to start seeing indications of how the Ron DeSantis votes were distributed? And how did that change so quickly in a week's time to go from single digits to what we got last night?
Well, I think it's important to remember that Donald Trump had about 40 to 42% of the electorate in New Hampshire locked up a year ago, if not 8 years ago. So his voters were there. And then you had a lot of people that were looking at other ones. You had the anti-Trumpers with Chris Christie. You had Nikki Haley trying to play a middle road. You had the Trump light candidates with Ramaswamy and DeSantis. But those in our polling, when Christie, if you ask Christie voters who their second choice was, it was Haley. And when he dropped out, they moved over to her. That's why she got this bump. But when first Ramaswamy and then DeSantis dropped out, their second choice was always Trump. So they drifted over to Trump. It was not a question in this election of Trump versus everybody else, or the anti-Trump. It was Trump, the Trump light, and the anti-Trumps. And the anti-Trump went for, instead of Trump light, they went for full strength Trump.
How about that? Sounds like that 30-point spread that I mentioned in the Emerson poll in South Carolina might still be the case. How about no labels? They've already come to New Hampshire a few times. I've seen Joe Manchin up there holding events on a potential third-party run. There's something New Hampshire-y about that, Andrew. If we get to Super Tuesday, do you take that group at its word that they will run a candidate? And how could it possibly work when they aren't going to be likely on the ballot everywhere?
Well, I think any third party is going to be a spoiler. And basically, you're going to have to start to look at who they're drawing votes from. And it's really way too early to start to even think about those things. Voters aren't paying that much attention, frankly, to the general election in the fall yet. They are in the early states like New Hampshire, Iowa, and then now coming up South Carolina. But the third party is going to have a very, very difficult challenge. As I mentioned, the voters in the United States can rationalize why their party is as bad as the candidate is better than the other party's candidate. And if you think back to third party candidates in recent memory, it was Ross Perot. He got 19% in 1992 with two kind of
amazing
candidates, but he didn't get a single electoral vote. He was a spoiler at best, not a really credible candidate for winning the election.
Not that we don't already have potential spoilers out there, right? RFK Jr. We've got third-party candidates that I could rattle off here that don't necessarily carry the no labels brand. What's the difference?
Not much, actually. I think RFK Jr. is probably in a better position than the no labels brand. They're not a known commodity. They're not a party in the traditional sense of a party. They're a movement, so to speak, at best. But they're going to need somebody who is a very charismatic person, very popular, very well known, who's going to be able to lead the charge. Because I don't think people are going to go and vote for a relatively unknown candidate that they don't know how they're going to govern, who will have no governing party in Washington, then looking at who their own candidate is and saying, you know what, I'll just stick with the tried and true, even if I don't really like it.
So add up RFK Jr., Cornel West, and the rest. Is there already enough potential interruption for Joe Biden to worry about? Sounds like yes.
Yeah, I think there is. I think that both candidates have to worry about this. It's just really too early for us to say who it's going to bite the hardest. You can make an argument both ways, but I think it's too early because, frankly, again, voters aren't paying attention much to this. Voters will pay attention to the elections when they have to, and that's usually just before the election. The money issue is important for the candidates and the campaigns. How do you keep this thing rolling if your your candidates aren't that popular? How do you keep voters engaged when they're looking at their candidates and neither party really is in love with their party's candidate? How do you keep them focused? And that's a hard thing to do.
Strikes me, Andrew, that if Donald Trump wanted to give this the appearance of shutting down the Republican primary, you just go ahead and announce a vice presidential pick right now. Remember when Ted Cruz tried to pull that off? Just form your own ticket before you even get to a convention. I don't know if you see that happening. It feels like something very Trumpy thing to do. Who's on the top of that short list? Will geography matter this time? Or are the normal rules in place, or does Trump seem to be the exception to that as well?
I think Trump's not likely to pay attention to the traditional things like choosing somebody from the other wing of your party or choosing somebody for their ability to draw votes in a battleground state or a large battleground state. I frankly think he's going to get a loyalist, somebody who's going to parrot the message that he has, who's not going to stray or say something that he might disagree with. And he's going to want somebody who's going to back him up in those legal troubles that he's got. So I think he's going to want somebody who's got an oath of loyalty to him. And I don't think that that's going to turn off the Trump voters. In fact, I think his supporters, if anything, want to see somebody like that rather than somebody from another wing of the party.
So you're talking at least Stefanik, a couple of other names around there. Carrie Lake might ring true to you. What do you think, Andrew?
I think that both of those people could be on his short list. They'll probably have to swear on a stack of Bibles that they'll pardon him if need be. But I think it's going to be tough for them to find somebody who has some national credibility, who's with Trump, who's not going to stray away from Trump, and who's not going to look like somebody who's been effectively politically neutered if they join the campaign.
So then, if it's the Trump campaign and no rules apply, that choice that's so important for presidential candidates probably won't move the needle in the polls, right? This is the most stable looking race that we've ever seen when it comes to Trump's base.
I think so. And actually, if you look at the political science on it, the vice presidential pick generally doesn't make much difference at all. As John Nance Gardner famously said, it's not worth being not worth a warm bucket of, as he said, spit. But he meant something else. It's not something that really the voters are waiting for. It's kind of a news story a bit. It's something to talk about during the convention when it's traditionally announced, but it's just not that big of a deal. And but in this case, we have two very old candidates for whom the choice of vice president looms a little bit larger than might be the case if the president is 50 years old. And yes, that's going to be, I think, the discussion is how young, how vigorous, and how this person would look as potentially a president before the end of the current president's term.
I've got less than a minute, Andrew Smith. Some suggested while I was in Manchester that the primary was broken. Is it going to be like the good old days 4 years from now?
There were many things that happened. If you walked on the streets of Manchester this weekend, it looked like a ghost town compared to past primaries.
It sure did.
The Democratic Party took the big step of essentially bypassing New Hampshire for the first time. They wanted to do it for decades, but they finally took the step. The Republican primary, it wasn't that interesting because of an incumbent. Perhaps the kind of the lull that we saw this year was due to the candidates in particular situations, but people have been after.
I want to see the carnival come back to town, Andrew Smith. It's great to see you again from the University of New Hampshire. This is Bloomberg.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Joe Biden and Donald Trump have something in common. They're both acting like the general election is now underway. They say it began last night. If you really look at the statements they both issued, listen to Donald Trump's speech, certainly. And that's why Joe Biden's day today is important, not with an eye on South Carolina, but Michigan, where today he's expected that the UAW will endorse his presidential bid, remembering Joe Biden became the first president to walk a picket line in his support of the UAW strike against the Big Three. We assemble our panel for their take on what happened last night and what may already be happening, even as Nikki Haley vows to stay on in this race. Lester Munson is with us, principal at BGR Group, Republican strategist, along with Alvin Jordan, ROKK Solutions Vice President, Democratic analyst. It's great to have both of you with us here. Joe Biden is acting like the general is underway. Alvin, would this endorsement from the UAW, which Donald Trump is also seeking, help him along the way in the months ahead?
Absolutely. I think regardless of what happens with Donald Trump and Nikki Haley, for President Biden, he for sure has to get on the campaign trail because it has started in effect for him. And the first thing from a priority standpoint that he has to wrap up is support. And if he can't, secure this, it would for sure put a wrinkle in his plans for how he would like to roll out his campaign officially. So he is, as you could imagine, there, trying to cash in on some of that goodwill. As you mentioned, that the first president to walk the picket line to actually come up with some official support, and I think he definitely needs it.
Well, so I guess that move paid off. It was considered controversial at the time here, Lester, but we also spoke while that was going on, while the strike was underway, about the fact that rank and file union workers, auto workers in Michigan, voted for Donald Trump in 2020. What will this do to change their vote? Do they follow Sean Fain and the leadership here?
Well, that remains to be seen. I suspect the rank and file is not going to follow their leadership on this issue. This is part of the Trump populist appeal, right? He's reaching out to the kind of the regular Joe past the elites, in this case, the union leadership, or that's certainly what he's going to try to be doing. This is a weak spot in the Biden coalition. So the fact that President Biden is acting like this is a general, I think he has to be doing that. It is very likely he's going to be facing Donald Trump. And this is a demographic that Trump is going to pursue aggressively and relentlessly. And so this is, you're absolutely right, Joe. This is the first step for the president in the general election.
How about that? I'm drawn to the headline on the front of the union leader, the New Hampshire union leader, which just days earlier endorsed Nikki Haley. Alvin, you saw the results last night. Another big win for Donald Trump. The headline, voters say they were motivated by Trump one way or another, suggesting that you had passion on behalf of his supporters and passionate protest votes by those, in many cases, independents who voted for Nikki Haley. Is that a strategy going forward? If you're the underdog and you're a protest vote as opposed to something people are voting for, can you sustain a campaign in that environment?
No is the short answer. And unfortunately, in one of the opinion pieces, I believe in the Times this morning, they used the phrasing of a lovely illusion. And I think that is so accurate in kind of where and how we've arrived today. I was in Iowa and actually got to hear some of what Nikki Haley was saying, and I looked around the room to take a quick inventory, and it very much seemed like she had the people on her side, as it were. And then, as we all know, it didn't go in her favor to the point of third place. And so I just think that we're seeing come to fruition a lot of what is and sounds great. I mean, even in the midst of, allegations and actual, court hearings where we see the former president out front and literally dealing with all of this, and people still show up by and large to support him. And so, again, I think from a President, Biden's point of view, you have to activate and believe that this is happening. And you can't really allow, whether Nikki Haley will stick around or kind of where she's arrived personally, to slow down the momentum that they'll need to garner support. Because if they do, I think what we'll look around and see, similar to 2016 in a different way, but definitely, where we are now, which is people show up, support, and vote for the former president pretty consistently.
Well, I'll tell you, the conventional wisdom of this day after the primary is that this is over, that Nikki Haley will eventually have to drop out of the race here. But she's got a lot of money, Lester. She's sinking $4 million into ads in South Carolina. At what point will she need to win something to keep this rolling?
Well, pretty soon. She's got a plausible case to make, right? South Carolina's her home state. She knows it. She's going to have to figure out a way to overcome this apparent 30-point gap with Trump. Can she appeal to Republican women voters? Can she appeal to those folks who are skeptical of Trump? Does he make some more mistakes on the stump? Does he have a health issue? Her being in the game might change it a little bit. This is a crazy year. I think it's a mistake to predict too much. Certainly Trump is in the best position here, but we've also got to look to see, the longer this goes on, the less likely it is that Trump is going to be able to prevail in the general. He's going to have to make a pivot to appeal to a broader range of voters. He's got to try to appeal to independents. He's got to try to appeal to Republicans who are skeptical of him. If he doesn't do that soon, it's going to become harder and harder and harder to do as this campaign goes onward.
Talk to us about independents, Alvin, among those who voted in New Hampshire, a state defined by its independent, or as they say, undeclared voters, 66% said they would not vote for Donald Trump in November if he was the nominee. That's advantage Biden.
You would like to think, and I think for the for the president, like that is an area where you have to go and try to capture as much of that as soon as you possibly can. I think again, to the points that we've made just previously, how much of that is actually real. I was taking a quick look at a couple of the town halls that were broadcast yesterday after the polls had closed. And even in the room, you could tell as people were kind of on the fence from an independent standpoint of not wanting to declare a vote for President Trump, that it still seemed that when it came down to it, they would, essentially toe the party line, or even from an independent perspective, kind of look that way. And I just don't think that you can necessarily trust that I will vote against President Trump will actually hold true. And if you're President Biden, I think you have to immediately, start trying to appeal and pull in some of those voters who are seemingly on the fence. Otherwise, I think we end up, as we have in the past, and are looking at another Trump administration, if that's a segment of people that the current administration can't pull to their side.
We're about to get crushed with a lot of ads, and having just survived Iowa and New Hampshire, they're still rattling around in my head. We've got less than a minute here for this part of our conversation. Lester, Nikki Haley's got 2028 to think about, a much longer road ahead than Donald Trump needs to worry about. A massive embarrassment in South Carolina, where she's polling now 30 points behind Donald Trump, could impact her chances down the road. Is that something she needs to avoid?
Who knows? I think all the old rules are out the window. Is DeSantis a plausible candidate in 28? Is Tim Scott? They've taken some hits and gotten some extra baggage here as they got out of the race. I don't know that there's a real good formula here for Nikki Haley. I think I like the fact that I confess I'm a little partial to her. I like the fact that she's fighting. I think that's going to resonate well for her. She is going to have to figure out, if she does this again in 4 years, assuming she doesn't get it now, how to appeal to those Trump voters. And being a little pugilistic might help her do that.
Great analysis from our panel. It's amazing what happens when you actually get some votes instead of just polling and forecast to talk about. Democratic analyst Alvin Jordan, ROKK Solutions, Republican strategist Lester Munson, BGR Government Affairs. Many thanks for the insights today.